Welcome to another episode of Beautiful, Bad and Bizarre. Today we're back at Putney Vale to remember and celebrate the life of the wonderful actor Jon Pertwee. Jon Pertwee's parents, Roland and Avis, already had a young son, Michael, who was born on the 24th of April 1916. The couple had separated before Jon's birth, but apparently while celebrating Victory Day on the 11th of November 1918 in Piccadilly Circus, they rekindled a night of passion, resulting in baby Jon Devon Roland Pertwee making his first appearance 9 months later on the 7th of July 1919. The Pertwee family had French Huguenot ancestry, and the original family name, which I will attempt to pronounce but apologise in advance, was Pertwee. But it was decided on arrival in England in around the 17th century to simplify the name to Pertwee, which Jon claimed to be a rather pointless exercise, as he was still subjected to a variety of interpretations of Pertwee over the years, including Peetweet, Peartree and Perky. Sadly, the reconciliation of his parents after Jon's birth was not to last long. Avis left Roland for his best friend, while also leaving the boys in the care of their father, who decided it would be better for his young sons to live with his mother and his brother Guy at the family home in Caterham on the Hill in Surrey. It was a complicated start for young Jon, but although he said he felt rejected by his mother, he also felt unconditional love from his grandmother, who he loved deeply in return. The family also had a second home in Kensington, London, where Jon recalled having many happy childhood memories. The Pertwees were an established theatrical, creative family. Jon's father Roland was a distinguished actor and writer. His brother Michael would become a famous screenwriter with several credits to his name, including episodes of Alfred Hitchcock Presents. Their second cousin was the comedy actor Bill Pertwee, best known for his role as Chief ARP Warden Hodges in Dad's Army. And it was Jon in later years that was to give Bill his first break. In the late 1950s, when Bill told Jon he was interested in going into the business, Jon said he could be his stooge for a summer season of variety performances, which got Bill started. As for Jon's own theatrical beginnings, he recalled in his memoir, Moon Boots and Dinner Suits, you can find the details in the description of this video, it was natural that the desire to show off in public would appear at a very early age, and I must have been 4 years old for my first performance in a small hall between High Street, Kensington and Earls Court Road. Several years later, in 1936, a 17-year-old Jon approached his father to let him know he wanted to be an actor, which Roland fully supported and approved of, and it was his father's brother Guy, who was a teacher at the Central School of Dramatic Art, who offered to help. Guy obtained an audition for his nephew with the principal of the school, Miss Elsie Fogarty, a formidable woman who had coached many of the greats, including Laurence Olivier. The audition consisted of Miss Fogarty rolling up a newspaper and thrusting the paper into Jon's mouth, telling him to bite down hard on it. After doing as he was told, Miss Fogarty declared, "You've a malformation of the mouth, young man. Your teeth are set incorrectly in your jaw, causing your tongue, which is too big for your mouth, to stick through your teeth instead of resting behind them. The result is a very sibilant S. I'm sorry, I've no place for you here at my school, and I would strongly advise you take up another profession." Jon recalled, "All my hopes and dreams went sailing out of this hell hag's window." But rather than admit defeat, he was more determined than ever, telling himself that he would show her how wrong she was. And he did indeed. As a consequence, Jon auditioned for the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts, commonly known as RADA, and despite numerous applicants, Jon Pertwee was accepted. However, this was not straightforward either. And the summer of 1936 was to be a desperately dark time for the teenage Jon when he lost his beloved granny to cancer. After his grandmother's funeral, Jon returned to his studies at RADA. During this time, it just so happened that his father Roland was governor there. However, Jon would strongly deny there was any nepotism involved, and that is somewhat backed up by the fact that his time there was exceedingly short. Sir Kenneth Barnes, the director of RADA, was of the opinion that Jon had no talent whatsoever, to the point that he made it clear he thought Jon Pertwee was incompetent, untalented, and with nothing to offer an honourable profession. Jon Pertwee was asked to leave after allegedly writing rude words on the toilet wall of the academy. Some years later, Jon Pertwee was to meet Charles Laughton, who said to him, "I understand you were thrown out of RADA." Jon said he flushed with embarrassment as he replied, "Yes, I'm afraid I was, Mr. Laughton." To which came the response, "Good, splendid fellow, then you're bound to do well. So was I. All the best people get chucked out of RADA." Jon Pertwee never let the negative comments and opinions of other people hold him back. He continued his journey towards his chosen career, auditioning and obtaining a place with a travelling theatre. After some time in rep, Jon returned to London in late 1938 with the aim of working in the West End. He also achieved a minor uncredited role in the film A Yank at Oxford, and in 1939 he had another uncredited minor role in the film The Four Just Men. Jon Pertwee had always had nightmares about war, in particular trenches, hand-to-hand fighting, bayonets and rats. To his mind, the army would always be out of the question for him, as was the thought of going into the Air Force. But, he said, ships were clean, food was regular, action took place at a distance, and therefore death, either dealt or received, was impersonal, and the best reason of all to join the Navy was, all the nice girls love a sailor. So there he was in 1939 at the start of World War II in the Navy at Portsmouth Barracks. By the 29th of November 1940, Jon Pertwee found himself serving on the ill-fated HMS Hood. Fortunately for Jon, he was transferred for officer training shortly before HMS Hood was sunk by the Bismarck in 1941, with the loss of practically all lives on board, apart from 3 men. During his naval career, Jon was blown up twice, on one occasion with his family being told he was missing, presumed dead. After the barracks at Portsmouth took a direct hit, Jon was left unconscious and stretchered away. When he came to, he found himself lying on a marble slab in a larder. On the shelf above Jon was another sailor, whose arm hung down before Jon's face. To get the sailor's attention, he gave the sailor's arm a tug, which brought the unfortunate corpse toppling down to the floor. Suddenly Jon realised he was surrounded by dead bodies. He began yelling and screaming, to the shock of an ashen-faced sick berth attendant, who opened the door as Jon screamed, "All these men are dead!" To which came the reply, "Blimey, mate, I thought you bleeping well was." Although, of course, you can replace the bleeping word with the F word, but I didn't want to drop that bomb. During his time in the Navy, Jon Pertwee met Eric Barker, future radio comedian, actor and writer. Jon and Eric would go on to work together. Jon Pertwee was eventually commissioned by the RNVR, the Royal Navy Voluntary Reserves, and transferred to Naval Intelligence, where he worked alongside future Prime Minister James Callaghan and Ian Fleming of Bond fame. Eventually, Jon Pertwee joined Naval Broadcasting. After leaving the Navy, Jon continued his acting career, and in 1947 he appeared uncredited as a police officer alongside Diana Dawes in the film Dancing with Crime. Soon he was working with Diana again in the 1948 film Penny and the Pownall Case. Jon and Diana would become lifelong friends. Jon Pertwee received his first star billing in 1953, alongside George Cole in the film Will Any Gentleman? During this film, he met his first wife, the actress Jean Marsh. Jon Pertwee, who was 35 at the time, married the 20-year-old Jean at St Nicholas Church, Shepperton, on Saturday the 2nd of April 1955. Sadly, their marriage wasn't to last, as it seemed they both wanted very different things from life. Jean, who was to become a dedicated and outstanding actress, wanted a career, and Jon wanted a family. He said, "She was in show business and I was in show business, so we seldom saw each other, and there's no business like show business for busting up a marriage. Believe me, it hurt a lot when we finally parted, and I had a nervous breakdown that somewhat threatened my career for a time." While it was without a doubt their marriage had hit turbulent waters, something happened that possibly hastened the speed of their divorce. In April 1957, Jon and Jean were staying as guests of Diana Dors and her husband, Dennis Hamilton, in the penthouse of their home at Woodhurst. Jon was working on stage in Croydon at the Grand Theatre on a Saturday evening, leaving Jean and Diana to have a chat before dinner. Unknown to the two women, Dennis had flipped a switch to record their conversation before he left the room. Diana recalled, "I knew her marriage to Jon was going through a fairly difficult phase. As we chatted in the way women do, she mentioned an actor with whom she'd fallen in love, and stupidly I talked about the handsome green-eyed stuntman and the fun we were having on the film. None of it was important." Soon Dennis had returned to the room. The housekeeper informed them dinner was ready, and Dennis urged Diana and Jean to go ahead, and he told them he would join them later. Within 10 minutes there was absolute chaos. Dennis had listened to the conversation and had flown into a violent rage. He ordered Jean and Diana to leave the house immediately, which they were both glad to do. The women drove to the Pertwees' London flat, trying to recall what they had said that evening that might have been on the tape. When Jon returned to Woodhurst at midnight after his cabaret show, he was confronted by Dennis, who played the tape to a bewildered and hurt Jon. In 1958, while on holiday in a small Austrian ski resort, Jon was to meet the love of his life, the dress designer Ingeborg Rosa. Recalling that meeting, Ingeborg wrote, "The attraction between us was immediate. I was a young German girl of 20, mesmerised by the much older, sophisticated Englishman." In 1959, Jon Pertwee took on a starring role in the BBC radio sitcom The Navy Lark with Leslie Phillips and Dennis Price, which would soon establish Jon as a household name. The series ran from 1959 until 1977 with 244 episodes. Early 1959, Jon was also in the process of divorcing Jean Marsh. When the divorce became final in 1960, Jon and Ingeborg married on the 13th of August 1960. The couple moved to Chelsea, and soon their daughter Dariel was born. 2 years later, she was followed by their son Sean. During the 1960s, Jon was never out of work. He appeared in 3 Carry On films: Carry On Cleo in 1964, Carry On Cowboy in 1965, and Carry On Screaming in 1966. He would also appear in Carry On Columbus in 1992. In 1967, Jon was appearing on Broadway in There's a Girl in My Soup. Diana Dors was to appear in the film version in 1970, along with Peter Sellers and Goldie Hawn. During this time, Jon Pertwee turned down a part in a new television sitcom being developed by Jimmy Perry and David Croft. The sitcom was none other than Dad's Army, and the part Jon turned down was Captain Mannering. Around the same time, another role was up for grabs, and it was the role that would make Jon Pertwee iconic, a role that even now new generations are discovering and enjoying, the now famous and legendary role of the third Doctor Who. The series had begun in 1963. The role of the Doctor was that of an extraterrestrial who appears in human form. He is a Time Lord whose exploits are chronicled in the TV show, along along with a time-travelling spacecraft called the TARDIS, which is used by the Doctor to explore the universe and encounter many a weird alien. Jon Pertwee had been second on the shortlist, with Ron Moody at the top, but it was decided to offer Jon the part of the Doctor without an audition. He was originally considered for the part because the BBC wanted to add an element of comedy into the show and thought Jon would be perfect with his range of character voices. However, Jon had a very different idea on how the Doctor should be presented, and he was determined to play the part straight, saying, "If I was going to play the Doctor, then he was not going to go in for any of that humorous stuff at all. I have always been an actor at heart, not a comic, and I wanted to do what I really enjoyed. I also wanted to use my own voice for a change." Jon also refused to sign a long-term contract. He wanted to take it year by year so that he could do all the other things he wanted to do and take advantage of anything new that came along that he might be offered. With conditions agreed on in 1970, Jon Pertwee became Doctor Who. Jon was later to say, "Despite all this interest in my science fiction and fantasy roles, I have never seen myself being a fan of science fiction or fantasy. On the whole, I prefer a good thriller or genuinely funny comedy, but science fiction and fantasy is what I'm remembered for." Although Jon was not interested in science fiction, he was passionate about fast vehicles and gadgets, and it was during the making of Day of the Daleks in 1972 that Jon had the pleasure of riding on one of the three-wheel power trikes while performing his own stunts. Of all the strange monsters Doctor Who encountered, the Daleks were Jon's least favourite. However, the Daleks absolutely terrified me as a child, although I was relieved to learn that only 3 were actually made. Jon was to profess that it was the Sea Devils in the episode following on from the Daleks that he actually had a soft spot for. In 1973, fellow Doctor Who actor and friend Roger Delgado died in a car accident in Turkey. Jon was devastated by the death of his friend, and around the same time, many of the team players on Doctor Who were leaving. Jon felt that carrying on when everyone else was leaving did not appeal to him, so he asked his agent to look for new work for him. When the BBC were informed he wanted to leave, they asked Jon to reconsider and to stay on for a little longer. Jon agreed on the condition that he was paid more. He asked for a rise of around 20%, and after a few moments of silence he was told, "Well, we'll be sorry to see you go." With that, it was mutually agreed that Jon would leave at the end of the season, his final episode transmitted on the 8th of June 1974. Jon's next best remembered role was, of course, in 1979's Worzel Gummidge. Jon was enthusiastic about the story of a living scarecrow. He loved the idea, but it wasn't easy to get off the ground. However, with Jon's legendary determination, he swept aside the tide of constant rejection from the powers that be, such as the BBC and Thames Television, and just as he had done at the beginning of his career, he ploughed on. Despite almost losing faith, eventually the series was accepted by Southern Television, and the rest is history. During his non-stop career, Jon had appeared in numerous television shows, films and on stage, including presenting children's programmes such as Jackanory and the voiceover on Super Ted. Jon had in the region of over 266 credits for his stage, television, film and radio. That's not including hundreds of personal appearances and guest appearances, and he was particularly loved at Doctor Who conventions. Jon Pertwee sadly died on the 20th of May 1996, aged 76. He was found dead in bed by his wife after he had died in his sleep of a heart attack while on holiday with his wife and friends in Connecticut in the USA. He was taking a short break from his popular one-man tour of Britain, which he was due to resume 3 days later. Jon Pertwee had also been planning a new comedy series with the actor Richard Briers. Close friend and broadcaster David Jacobs said, "It is too terrible for words. Jon was one of the funniest men that Britain has ever produced. One of the greatest character actors. He was marginally eccentric. He lived his life to the full." On being typecast by 2 well-known roles, Jon Pertwee had said, I'm very much afraid to say it, but I'm rather a cult figure. On his future, he'd stated, "Actors don't retire, they fade away like old generals. I just want to peter out, not rust out. I get desperately bored when I'm not working." Jon had been tremendously successful in his career, but his fundamental philosophy was always to just have fun and enjoy the ride of life. Jon Pertwee was flown home, and on the 29th of May 1996 a private funeral service was held for close friends and family here at Putney Vale Crematorium. It's unknown what happened to Jon's ashes, so you may remember on a recent visit to the grave of Sandy Denny, I came across the memorial to a young lady by the name of Kim, who passed away just before her 20th birthday. I leave flowers for Kim and Sandy each time I visit Putney Vale, and I thought it would be lovely to leave flowers at Kim's grave in memory of Jon too. Thank you so much for joining me here today in this step back in time at Putney Vale. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I look forward to seeing you all again soon.